In this, the second of our user experience design talks, we're going to have a look at the importance of specially structuring information. So this is really going to tie into initially having a look at how we see structure and how we actually tend to see structure, and then linking or tying that into how we then go about designing or potentially designing our user interfaces. Nice example in terms of the image here. It indicates that when we look at something, there are certain special arrangements, certain structures that tend to stand out, which means to say that we're wired up effectively to recognize, to automatically, subconsciously recognize and to see these structures. So most people looking at this, you'll get the impression that there is a square shape in the middle, though in reality there's an absence of that square shape. We just happen to be inclined to see it, to see the edges, or imagine that we're seeing the edges of it. And all of this ties into how we observe and perceive structure within different visual scenes. And it's been known for a long time that the brain is naturally wired up to see things in certain ways. And we're going to have a look at some of the principles here, known as the gestalt principles, from a bunch of actually German psychologists. It was almost about 100 years ago, back in the 1920s, where they did a formal study into how we generally do perceive structure based on different arrangements. Now, we're going to look at a number of them here. Some of them are very, very applicable to user interface design. Some of them less so, but we include them because they're interesting. And the key message we're trying to get across within this one is that there are certain structures that we will automatically see. And given that, if we were to design our interfaces to support or to use or to leverage these structures, then we can, as long as we align things, we can quite easily and effortlessly get across a structure, an intended structure, to the user. So we'll start off with the first of our Gestalt principles, the one of proximity. And the basic notion of this principle is that the relative distance, and it is relative, between different shapes, they provide, or that provides quite a powerful cue to our brains in terms of how we group things together. So generally speaking, objects that are near each other, relatively speaking, we will see them as being grouped together. And we've got some examples shown over on the right hand side. So if you look at the set of 12 sort of dark purplish stars that we have on it, most people looking at that, we will perceive that as 3 rows of 4. And if we look at the orange stars we have next to them, most people will perceive that as 3 columns of 4 stars. So in both cases we have 12 stars, but either we view it horizontally or vertically. And the cue that enables our brains to do that is the relative distance between them. So for the sort of the purpley coloured ones, they are closer on a horizontal spacing than they are in a vertical spacing. So we then group them together into a horizontal, a row of 4, and we have then 3 rows of 4. And it's the other way around in terms of the orange stars, where we have 3 columns of 4. And that special partitioning is quite a powerful factor. The orange and the black dots that we see underneath, in some cases we're actually mixing the dots together, but because of their special arrangement, that trumps the actual mixing of colours, and there we see it as 4 groupings of 8. Even if some of the groupings have mixed colours within them, we still perceive them as a separate, coherent grouping on its own regard. And obviously, this has a very significant impact in terms of how we design our interfaces. That if we have a bunch of controls that we want to visually group together, or to tell to the user, look, this group of controls is all related one to another, and here's a separate group of controls which does something different, then that is a very direct impact about how we should be specially setting out and positioning these controls, so that when the user scans the screen, if you like, the structure automatically jumps out at them. The next gestalt principle is one of similarity, and this says that objects that are similar in appearance appear grouped, all other things being equal. And that's the important bit, that if there isn't, sort of, for example, any special cues about how things are arranged, all other things are roughly equal, then what the brain tends to do is that if it sees things that are of a similar colour to one another, or similar shape, things like that, then we will group them together. You see a couple of examples of this. So as opposed to our stars that we have, as opposed to a cluster of 4x4 stars, again, we'll see that then as different rows, because we're going to group the 4 hollow stars as one coherent group. Next up is the principle of continuity, and this says that we perceive continuous forms rather than disconnected segments. IBM's logo is quite a famous one, where we look at that and we don't have any difficulty recognizing the I, the B, and the M, and we perceive it in that way. Likewise, if we have the crossed lines, and there's different ways of interpreting this. This could be a circle with 4 different line segments coming out from it. But we're more likely to look at those line segments and to imagine them as continuous, that the circle notionally sits on top of a continuous line as opposed to 2 separate lines. Next up is the notion of closure, that if we, and this ties into the example we had of the square, we'll try to close open figures. We almost sort of see virtual lines in our mind's eye. So if you're looking at the zebra here, or the triangle, it's hard not to imagine that you're seeing an enclosed shape, that there is sort of a enclosing boundary to that, even though there isn't actually anything drawn on the paper or shown on the screen that would definitely do that. So again, it's our tendency to try to close these things, to say that things represent objects as a whole, and even if we're missing some of the information, the brain is inclined to fill that information in, to say, oh, it must surely be there, even if it isn't there. Symmetry is our next of our gestalt principles. And this is quite an important one, because if we're looking at a scene, we generally view it in a way that reduces the perceived complexity. Now, you need to define what complexity is there, but the brain is set up to try to simplify what it is in terms of seeing things. So for crossed lines, for example, at the top, we will see it as 2 cross straight lines as opposed to 2 angular lines that have been brought together. And the grouping of braces at the bottom, again, we will tend to group them together, because we will consider that to be a more sensible, a less complex pattern than the one, let's say, at the very, very bottom. Figure and ground, we're getting onto the end of our sort of the gestalt principles that we're putting in. Again, this is quite a relevant one. So when we look at something, we generally try to separate a scene into foreground elements. So these are things that attract our attention, and the rest then we generally classify as background elements. And the brain actually can swap between these 2 different things. So if you look at for example, depending on your perspective and which way you're looking at it, either you're viewing then the flowers as the foreground element with sort of a leafy stem, or you're viewing it as potentially a sort of a female face. Likewise with the squares at the bottom, again, you can almost swap between these here, but most people, when they're looking at the squares, they will generally, at least initially, perceive the white one as a white background with a black square, and the darker coloured one as a darker coloured one with a hole in it. That generally is the first perception, though you can swap between the 2 different perspectives. Common fate then is our last gestalt principle. This one says that if we have a bunch of objects that move together, we perceive them as being grouped together, that they are related one to another. Okay, so gestalt principles, key thing to get across there is that we are wired up to see certain forms of information and to structure information in a certain way. That's important because given the scene, we need to quite quickly and effortlessly classify it to make sense of what it is that we see. So we use visual structure. It is a fundamental thing about how we operate. What that means is that if we want to create an application, we should be thinking quite closely and carefully about how it is we are structuring the information, the controls, whatever it is that we are presenting to the user. And we want to do it in a way where if you like, the default forms of visualization, the default assumptions that we make for structure, that is apparent within it. So visual hierarchies are the way that in which we can do this here. There's a very simple definition of a hierarchy. Here's all as you would expect. So visual hierarchy separates information into different sections and subsections, obviously. Clearly labels each section and subsection to identify its content. So if you have a hierarchy, it's important to understand what each of those sections represent, and then presents them to user in the form of a hierarchy. The nice thing about hierarchies is the bottom. Well-structured information can be easily and quickly scanned. Simple information can often be more easily understood. Two parts to that. Quite often when the user is using an application or browsing a website, they do not read it word by word by word. They scan through it quickly to try to find the thing that they are interested in, and then they read that particular thing or otherwise interact with it. So by structuring things within a nice hierarchy, a hierarchy that makes sense to the user, we can help the user find what it is they are looking for. So I'm going to give you a few examples of this. I've got an example here for a chunk of text advising people to create a clear visual hierarchy. The text on the left-hand side is just as presented as a big body of text, and exactly the same information is presented on the right-hand side. But in this case, we have structured it into a hierarchy, a special positioning that presents a hierarchy. So we have a title, we have sort of a clear key heading to the top of that, and we're then going down to the size, the prominence, and the content relationships. So we're saying that there's 3 main points within this in terms of some of the detail. It's very, very easy for a person to scan the one we have on the right hand side to get an indication of what it's about, to see the 3 different items, to get an overview of those items, and then to decide, is this what I'm looking for? Do I want to read it in more detail? Am I happy to skim over it? The one on the left hand side just presents it as a large group of text. Effectively the user's forced into a position where they have to read this, where it's much, much more difficult to scan through it. They don't know which bit they can jump over if they think, well, I already know all about the size, where does the next bit begin? That's not apparent. They have to actually scan through all of the text. Got a couple more examples here of things which are not necessarily set out badly, but there are more effective structures for doing it. So if you have a look at the example on the top right for a particular airline flight being booked, unstructured form is just presented as a chunk of text. It's not a large amount of text, and it's all important text. You know, you're booked on a certain flight, departs at from a certain location and a certain date and time. The structured one retains the core information, but removes some of the wordiness from it, and then puts it out in terms of really getting across the essence and the heart of it. Much more easily scanned, much more easily digested. Similar to the example we have at the bottom, which is one providing some information on a set of mortgage payments. The example on the right, I mean, it was set out in a certain way. You may think, oh, it looks okay, but it's actually hard to scan that. In this case, for this type of information is easier. We're saying that we're providing a list of different elements with some monetary value or numerical value next to it. So there is a visual structure that better gets across that grouping of information. So we should help the user easily separate what's relevant to the goals from what is not. In some cases, we will want to second guess what the user's goals are in terms of the particular package that we're information providing to the user. In other cases where we're providing lots of options, the users may come in with one goal, and we just really want to help the user identify the thing that is relevant to their particular goal and let them get on with it. To do this, we want to structure information in a hierarchy. Now, information control, all of this stuff, we want to emphasize key information. So if you like, the structural elements of our hierarchy, we want to make sure they are visible to the user. Use lists, use tables, a whole host of different things to manage complexity, to group things together so the user can understand there is a grouping and then can make a quick assessment. Do they need to delve into that grouping or skip over it? Provide a clear visual flow through the hierarchy. And we'll see this in some of the other things. So basically we want to let the user be able to scan through that hierarchy, and by the process of scanning through it, really sort of usually top to bottom, left to right, depending which way the scanning is happening, that they can locate the element that they're interested in. So basically we should support scanning, don't disrupt it. Key takeaways in this, we are indeed hardwired up to see certain forms of visual structure. We can very quickly scan information. We're very good at scanning things, of sort of looking down and, well, if you design a structure that maps on well to how we do scan, then we can go through that very quickly. We can get a feel for it. We can decide if something's relevant and it's not relevant. The challenge for us, I suppose, as designers is how do we structure things in a way that the user can quickly and easily scan it. And we'll see some more examples of how to do that in some of our later UX design talks.